Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome to the podium Gilly Gibson, Mayor of North Sydney.
Thank you, Martin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome, Ted, and welcome, friends of Ted. It is just wonderful to see this theatre filled tonight with people to come along and join in to hear about Ted's life and his work in the North Sydney area. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their ancestors and spirits. I'd also like to acknowledge the myriad nations, cultures and nations that make up the municipality of North Sydney. The Ted Mack Oration is being held to honour Ted Mack, the Mayor of North Sydney from 1980 to 1988. I'm absolutely delighted that Ted is here with us tonight, and I extend a warm welcome to Ted and members of his family who are also with him. I'd like to extend a very special welcome to Associate Professor Elizabeth Farrelly, who will give tonight's address. Welcome, Elizabeth. Well, I started my day down at the Kirribilli Neighbourhood Centre, attending a play group with my children. And given my role here tonight, I was instantly started to think about Ted, because I know Ted was instrumental in the formation of the Kirribilli Neighbourhood Centre. And I know that Ted not only lent his architectural expertise to developing that centre, but also got in there and rolled up his sleeves on the weekends to form part of a working bee to make sure that the fairly derelict building was brought back to life and is now the wonderful community centre that is much loved by the North Sydney community. Look, I'm not sure whether the details are correct on every Ted story I've been told, but that's not important here tonight, and I've heard enough stories to know that Ted holds legendary status here on the lower North Shore. Ted was a North Sydney councillor for 14 years, holding the position of mayor for 8 years. He concurrently held the state seat of North Shore for 7 of those years. Ted then moved on to federal parliament, holding the seat of North Sydney from 1990 to 1996. While he was not the first independent in any of these forums, he was at the vanguard of the independence movement and has often been referred to as the father of independence. Those of you who know Ted will know he's a man of strong convictions. He was a pioneer of open government and community engagement, committed to reducing wasteful expenditure and improving urban planning. Under his leadership, North Sydney Council was the first to commission a heritage study, which laid the groundwork for heritage conservation areas. He created Civic Park, refurbished North Sydney Oval, cemented precinct committees and community consultation into council decision-making processes, and pursued alternative streams of income to make council less reliant on rates. As an architect, Ted applied his architectural skills to public life. Like most architects, he was both a big picture and a detail thinker. At the macro level, Ted explored ideas for the best approaches to town planning, suggesting that bottom-up democratic planning would produce better results than centralised planning by experts. At the same time, he would involve himself in micro decisions, walking the streets with staff, giving them very specific directions here and there about where a tree should be planted or the route of a path through a public park. Ted brought lateral thinking to the mayoral table as well. He was quick to adopt the concept of floating floor space, selling the development rights above council buildings to developers who wanted additional height in our CBD. He ploughed the returns back into infrastructure, including renewing North Sydney Oval and creating our beautiful civic park. As a designer, Ted cared about the aesthetics of North Sydney. He sought to manage development and maintain the character of each suburb. He also created a cohesive colour palette and design across park and street signs, bus stops and council buildings. Not many councils understood the power of branding as well as Ted did at that time. One staff member was reminiscing today about her first week in council. This was back in 1998, after Ted had already departed. And she was on the phone and a resident who just moved into Miller Street rang and said, "What colour do I need to paint my house?" The staff member was rather puzzled, and then the resident had to explain to her that Mr. Mack wanted all the buildings in Civic Park to be the same colour, and she wanted her house to fit in. So when a mayor is still influencing what colour a house is painted, 10 years after they've left office, you know that mayor has real charisma. There isn't time to tell all the Ted stories tonight, but I can't finish without mentioning Ted's commitment to reducing wasteful spending. Under his leadership, staff were told to use the public phone in the foyer of the council building for personal calls, not the phone on their desk, and to bring their own tea bags and milk. He applied the same strict rules to councillors who ate party pies for supper while the neighbouring councils were still enjoying splendid silver service meals. Ted, we've actually loosened the reins a little over the years, but the lean, green, progressive character of North Sydney Council has its roots in your era. It's a huge legacy, and I've only just scratched the surface here. I know many of you would have your own Ted tales to tell and may want to share them over supper later on. Given Ted's commitment to good government, architecture and urban planning, I'm sure you understand why we've chosen to hold a public lecture on these topics in his name. And who better to give the talk than Elizabeth Farrelly, who teaches and writes so eloquently on these subjects. Elizabeth is currently an associate professor with the Australian Graduate School of Urbanism at the University of New South Wales. She will be familiar to many in this room as a regular columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald, where she is sometimes the only independent voice in a sea of developer-funded interest groups, all wanting to have their say. Good on you, Elizabeth. I'm sure that in the true Ted Mack style, Elizabeth's address tonight will be informative, enjoyable and thought-provoking. Please help me and join in and welcome Associate Professor Elizabeth Farrelly to the stage.
I'm going to move that a bit. Thank you, Mayor Gibson. Thank you and welcome to, in particular, to Ted and Wendy and Jenny Mack and other members of the Mack family, and to Genia McCaffrey, I think is here tonight, although I haven't seen her, former Mayor of North Sydney. So, and also to everybody else, thank you for being here. I wanted to start by saying something a little peculiar, that's very me, which is, for some reason, a lot of people around me are sick at the moment, and I don't think it's my fault, but it makes me think, you know, when we think about cities and planning and, you know, politics and making all that stuff happen, that it's important to remember, you know, there's this big thing, this big, weird, mysterious, beautiful thing called life that nobody really understands, especially people who pretend that they do. And inside that is this other stuff called cities and city politics and, you know, all that argy-bargy that we're going to talk about tonight. And it seems to me that it puts a slightly different perspective on city planning when you think of it, you know, which we normally think of as a fairly technical thing, when you remember that it is part of this big, mysterious adventure that we're all in for a while. Anyway, so that's a kind of, that's what I think of as a sort of personal welcome to country. We live in dark times. I've always wanted to open a speech with those words. Honestly, though, I never thought I would say them and mean them. I do, though, think we are living in dark times, for democracy in particular, a time when democracy itself seems to be failing us, and not in a small, incidental kind of way, but failing at its core. Across the world, it seems democracy is failing to protect the very thing we trusted to its care, the common good. Instead, and increasingly, democracy is doing what it was meant specifically to avoid, that is, delivering us into the hands of demagogues and dictators, bringing hatred, division, and misery, and making those things okay. At least okay to the majority, somehow. Even more dangerously, I think, it seems to be closing down discussion, strangling knowledge, and all the while taking the planet itself to the very brink of catastrophe. Yet, for all that, democracy and the democratic ideal has never seemed more beautiful. Maybe because it now seems so fragile, like some mythical orchid that we can imagine but never quite grasp. So that's what I want to talk about, the kind of open, honourable democracy of which Ted Mack has always been a beacon, and whether this kind of democracy is still possible for us here. I'm going to go back because I want just to talk about, I like this photo of Ted Mack because it looks so statesmanlike and sort of far-seeing. But you see those wrinkles on his forehead. That's because what he's seeing, which is the future that we are now making, and the city in particular that we're now wrecking, in my view. I'm not greatly given to reverence, but being invited to meet Ted Mack the other day in person for the first time, I felt genuinely honoured. And I felt so honoured that I put it on Facebook, which is not something I do all that much. And the response was overwhelming. There were people who, I have way too many friends on Facebook. There were people who saw Ted once in a shopping centre and said, "Oh, I saw him, but I was too shy to tell him how much I admired him." There were people who'd lived across the road and thought him the perfect neighbour. People who'd lived in North Sydney and thought him the perfect mayor, quite a few of those. Excuse me, people who'd lived in Waverton and used to hand out for him on HIV or other issues. People who lived in Cremorne, not even his ward. And yet he'd bowled up one day to help them get approval for a carport that he thought was reasonable but knew would not be approved on the rules. A woman whose mentally ill father, Ted Mack, had helped get compensation when his boarding house closed. And on and on. All of the stories, everybody has, as Shirley Gibson has said, everybody has a Ted Mack story. And they're all like that. It's amazing. A great man, people said. Unlike most politicians today, he's up there with Bob Brown, a lot of people said, as the most honourable and most loved, but also most respected politician of all time. These days, you'd be inclined to dismiss that kind of talk as spin, but everybody agrees. Robin Reid, who worked closely with Ted for years and who actually gave her apologies tonight, could not be here, but on whose ticket Ted Mack first stood for council, says, and I quote, "All those stories about the human touch, putting the garbage out, changing the light bulbs, they're all true." So it is with unaccustomed reverence, some pride, and no small sense of humility that I deliver this rather grandly named Ted Mack Oration. Also, I have to say, a small amount of anxiety, since oration suggests oratory. I feel as though I should be in a toga, you know, and a kind of one of those olive leaf tiara thingies. And I'm only me talking about what I think. But meeting Ted the other day, I realised we actually have quite a lot in common. We both have backgrounds in architecture. We both spent time in elected local government. We were both invited because of something we'd written about city planning. And both, I think it's fair to say, hold staunchly to the idea of political independence as advocates for truth, openness, fairness, and city amenity. In all of those, of course, it goes without saying, in fact, that Ted Mack's are the big footsteps and mine are the size 6 Jimmy Choo stilettos. But, you know, I've always wanted small feet, so there we go. I was actually elected, that's a picture of us just before we were elected to council in 1991. Frank Sartor was in the front, looking quite pleased with himself. And I'm at the back looking also pleased. In fact, I'm looking like I think it's a big joke. That's before we got elected. By then, Ted had been a North Sydney alderman for 14 years, mayor for 8, state MP for 7, before resigning to avoid $1 million payout, fairly special, and federal MP for 1 year. He was already, irrefutably, father of the independents. We were standing as independents. We were seeing ourselves as a kind of new broom for the city, in a tradition made glorious since then by Clover Moore. And we were conscious of being Ted Mack's children, if you like. Back in 1980, in his first council meeting as mayor on October the 14th, Ted Mack presented a mayoral minute which had 4 parts. First part was the famous resolution to sell the mayoral Merc and put the money towards a community bus. The second was to use a leftover piece of council land, for community housing. The third was a resolution not to take council into closed session unless absolutely necessary and supported by 2/3 of council for reasons that were publicly stated. And fourth was about a residential flat code, which is essentially what we would now call urban design, designed to respect, preserve and enhance North Sydney's public spaces, which might on the face of it seem like a slightly random collection of measures: car, housing, open session, urban design. But if you consider them in the light of principle, it becomes obvious that the first two, car and community housing, are about justice. The third is about truth, and the fourth, the flat code, is about, for want of a better word, beauty. So those 3 principles, justice, truth and beauty, form the themes of this talk, which are sort of, if you like, the vertical threads. Cutting across them, I want to talk step by step. First of all, a little bit about Ted Mack and why he should be regarded as an inspiration to all of us. Secondly, a little bit about democracy and what I think we might be able to do to save it. And thirdly, about Sydney and why I think it's worth saving. So, Ted Mack, of course, was an architect, and architects, as you may know, drive Citroens. There are a number of other distinguishing marks, which if you don't know any architects, you might want them pointed out. If you're in the jungle, hunting one, for example. They have fancy pens. They wear funny round Corbusian spectacles very often. They have often quite loud and sometimes unmatching socks, despite the otherwise black attire. And they wear often coloured, sometimes floral or polka-dotted bow ties. And they drive Citroens. I've never known why Citroens and architects. I've asked a few. They mutter things about design and genius. I think it's probably that there's something irrevocably left bank about the Citroen. It's a sort of intellectual, sort of arty intellectual's car. I've always loved them myself. When we were students, they were light 15s, as they were known then, De Chevaux, of course, and the DS. It may be something to do with the fact this is Alison and Peter Smithson's Citroen. For those who don't know, Alison and Peter Smithson were very frightening architects who built almost nothing and talked an awful lot and intimidated a lot of people. It's a very good way to get famous if you're an architect, let me just say that right now. Still a good way to get famous. So this is in a place called Upper Lawn in Font Hill, 1959. Harry Seidler also drove Citroens. This is true. This is true. I did not make this up. Harry Seidler drove Citroens for 40 years. Every boss I ever worked for, and there's about a few, drove Citroens. It's true. Even now, I know some who own 4 or 5 or sometimes 6. I know that's greedy. So the Ted Mack Citroen is part of a tradition. And the move to sell the Mayor Merc and use the Citroen instead was, of course, partly about integrity and partly about saving money, but also a declaration that who Ted Mack wasn't going to change. So he was going to take his professional and principled self with him into public life. This is, I think, significant. The 80s, I'm saying this with a straight face, the 80s were still the Tammany Hall days of local government in Sydney. I'm saying it with a straight face because some people would say they've never ended. But back then, nepotism, featherbedding, and self-interest were the order of the day. Politics was almost expected to be public life as the exchange of private favours. Against that background, Ted Mack, I would suggest as a man of principle, stood in stark contrast. Having grown up in Mascot, changed schools often, been strongly influenced by his builder grandfather, studied architecture at New South, where I currently teach, as it happens, graduating in 1957 as part of the second ever architecture cohort. He took a job with, I was going to say the government architect, but then someone pointed out that there's the government architect and there's the public works and then there's the Housing Commission. And it's nuanced. So I'm going to say public service and just be safe. Because I've heard Ted talk about being in the Housing Commission and was later head of hospitals when, in 1967, so that's 10 years later, when he performed what he regards as his first political act, organising a petition to bring back Utzon, who'd left the country, and of course his half-built opera house a year before, and the previous year at least. So this is a poster by John Kinsella, designed by John Kinsella, who was also working with the government then. And then, as now, there was pressure to conform. Ted recalled when we were talking, and I'm quoting, the senior architects who signed the petition were called into a room and grilled, being urged to put up another petition rescinding the first one, while the government architect, the boss, sat in the room watching and puffing his pipe. Utzon, as you know, did not return, and as far as I know, the architects did not rescind their petition. But around the same time, Ted was becoming incensed by the Askin-affiliated, say that loosely, don't want to libel anyone here, North Sydney Council approving towers around his house, 3 of them, I believe. He became involved in the local precinct committee, and in 1973, by now Assistant Chief Architect at the New South Wales Housing Commission, published an extraordinary and prescient critique of Sydney city planning. And it was this that got him elected eventually. But in it, he coined the verb to jellyfish. Personal favourite. He wrote, this is in case you don't know what they look like. He wrote, and again I quote, "The widest possible public participation must become a reality, not a political gimmick. Or planning will continue," and again I quote, "to jellyfish along the road of Toffler's future shock." I think it's a very nice metaphor. I think it's still appropriate. Even now, planning is a kind of shapeless creature that looks plausible, appears to have substance but melts on contact, lacks all discernible purpose or direction, and has tentacles everywhere. I was going to add, and some of them poisonous. Towers around your house, that could be Redfern, where I live now. It could be Waterloo, could be Bondi Junction right now. And I quote, highwayman's bulldozer destroying your neighbourhood, that could be Burwood, it could be St Peter's right now, or Rozelle. The gimmickry and pretense of government planning, that could be, well, actually that could be anywhere in Sydney right now. 44 years later, and so little has changed. Ted Mack proposed a Jane Jacobs, what I think of as a Jane Jacobs take on city planning. He wanted respect for the small, the old, the slow, the intricate, and the organic, as well as all the other stuff. For terrace houses, and he notes being shocked that people would pay more than $35,000 for a terrace in Sydney. And high streets rather than single-use zoning or abstract concepts and just sort of concrete towers everywhere. He argued insistently and consistently for genuine public participation as being the only way of producing cities that people would actually like and use and feel at home in. And it was on the strength of that article that he was approached by Robin Reid, who was already an independent councillor, and in 1974 was elected as an alderman, as we were then. 6 years later, he became mayor. Yes. I've lost a slide, sorry. As alderman, he walked out every time council closed a meeting. As mayor, he says he refused to close meetings at all, for any reason, legal or commercial, and certainly not to save the embarrassment of the politicians or their mates, which is actually the usual subtext these days. It became a rule to involve the precincts in all decisions that affected them. Councillors were banned from precinct meetings unless specifically invited, and decisions of precincts had to be respected. As mayor, he says, he answered every letter written to him with a personal visit. He helped people mend their washers, fix their taps, put out the garbage. There's a lovely story, which I did quote in the paper, but I'm going to just tell you quickly again. One day, a lady called the council to say that she'd been parked into her driveway. The council said to call the police, and the police said to call the NRMA. The NRMA said to call the council, naturally. Finally, she called the mayor's office. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, said Ted. Luckily, he reflects now, he kept a rolling jack in the boot of his car, famous car. But you know, it's pretty special. I think that's pretty special from a mayor. No wonder people loved him. So that's truth, I guess, as a principle, and that's also justice, a sense of the important voice of principle that he brought also to his time in state politics and then later to federal politics. The same important voice of principle shone through in the North Sydney independent movement, as it was called, that he helped establish in 1991 after being elected to the federal seat of North Sydney. In a letter of invitation to residents, he noted that, quote, "Over the last 15 years or so, a set of values and aspirations has developed in the North Sydney area, which could loosely be described as the independent movement." But it wasn't just the popular touch. If you ask Ted Mack even now which level of government matters most, he'll say, without missing a beat, local. And why? Because you're actually doing things. As mayor, he initiated North Sydney's first heritage study, its first conservation plans, established Civic Park after defeating a tower project, proposed to build a 100-acre park on top of the Warringah Expressway, and completed council's office block to help keep the council financially independent. But the best thing he ever did, he says, was North Sydney Oval. Why? Because it's beautiful. And yes, he says it's true that he personally positioned just about every one of the 7,000 trees and used to walk around with the head of open space, you know, pointing out where they should go. I even designed the seats, he told me. And again, I'm quoting, "Hyde Park back then was a museum of public seating. Wendy and I went there, found our favourite, copied the curve onto a piece of cardboard, modified it a bit, and got the council blacksmith to make it." Sounds like the last century, doesn't it? Rather, I mean, the one before. Once an architect, though, always an architect. Local government matters because it's close to the ground and therefore close to the making of the real world where real people really live. Which brings me to the second topic, a quick skirmish with democracy. We hear a lot these days about strong leadership. Putin, Trump, Netanyahu, Howard, Abbott. I don't think anyone accuses Malcolm Turnbull of being a strong leader. But maybe. The idea is that an inflexible bloke pushing people around is needed in times of trouble, and that this constitutes strength. I think that's diametrically wrong. What we see as strength is usually bullying, and bullying is weakness. Bullying comes from a place of fear. This fear, which is usually fear of not being in control or not being sufficiently respected or given sufficient status, that fear makes politicians susceptible, even without being technically corrupt, to those who have money and power, which is to say, in particular, corporations. And that's why apparently strong governments are in fact the ones to distrust. Hidden weakness produces hidden agendas. I give you WestConnex, Sydney Light Rail, French's Forest Hospital, Parramatta Heritage Precinct with 3,000 apartments being built next to the female factory, central to Farrelly, Barangaroo, and of course the casino, all on public land, all for private profit. In this world-making enterprise, local democracy is the most important kind, but it is also, in Australia, the most fragile. In most countries, local government is the original form, predating the others and therefore independently recognised. Here, it's last come, worst dressed. Local democracy is designed to fail, with no constitutional right to exist and no tradition of respect. I think this is why Clover makes governments so cross that they keep trying to design legislation specifically to get rid of her and failing, which is good. Visitors to this country, though, and I meet quite a few, in particular visitors with planning and urbanist backgrounds, especially those from Europe and the UK, but also from the US and even from Hong Kong, are nearly always shocked by our attitudes, by government attitudes in particular, by government preparedness to be blatantly exploitative of public good and public space, but also that we stand for it and that we allow one level of elected government to sack another. That just strikes everyone as bizarre. It's an old ruse, of course. There's a thing in the city of Sydney called the Sydney concertina syndrome. It's happened so often that it's got a name, which is the boundaries of the city of Sydney shrink with Liberal governments and expand with Labor governments because they want the business vote, so they just go CBD, and then they want the residents who are meant to be lefty, so they, so this kind of, but to do that, of course, you have to, quite often, we have to sack the count. Well, I don't really want to, what am I supposed to do? A sacking is often required if you want to get a gerrymander happening, so that's what they do. And it's happened so many times, it's named. When we were, see, that's the picture that should have been before. This is a picture of us with the Queen. At the front of the Sydney Town Hall, Queen's in the middle. Next to her is the Lord Mayor. She's the one with the crown. I'm the one with all the hair. Tall on the side. Obvious. So, kind of irrelevant, except that we did regard us, this is about the only time we actually wore our robes, which regarded mostly as being badges of corruption. Usually, the bigger the bunch of lace, the more corrupt the Lord Mayor, we figured. It's a rough rule of thumb. Anyway, so we regarded ourselves as being a new broom, as I said. There's a picture, a really weird picture of me. This rather naive approach to getting rules that were really clear and straightforward and impartial and applied to everybody, but just naive, really. So after a while, I realised that things were not happening. We were passing resolutions and things were not being done. And I went, as you do, to the town clerk, a man called Leon Carter, and he said, I said to him, so how can we actually get things happening? We want to change some things. And he looked at me pityingly and said, read this book. Slim, dark cover volume with gilt lettering designed, I think, to resemble a kind of cult Bible. I thought it was one of those props from the life of Brian, actually. And actually, not so far from the truth. It was designed, I now see, to fob off pesky councillors who wanted irritatingly to change things. In other words, all form and no content. I'm show you your page here, beautifully laid out, yes, stylish design. Local government special. Back in the day, back in the day. But what it says here, for example, is, this is part of its text, although the power to carry out road work is an optional responsibility, the idea that a council might not carry out any road work is unimaginable. I thought that was great, very useful, like advice for a young bride. And still, weirdly, nothing changed. We read the book, nothing changed. We decided to do this or that, and we would say, the Lord Mayor would say to the town clerk, do we have the money for this? And the town clerk would nod wisely and say, yes, Lord Mayor, you have the money for this. We were doing heritage lists and laneway preservation studies and energy audits, which upset a few people, and things like height limits. And we were also working with Paul Keating, just actually... This is just after he won, if you remember, the 1993 unwinnable election. But before that election, he came to us and said, why don't we fix up Circular Quay, East Circular Quay? The building's too big, isn't it? And Frank said, no, and I said, yes. And it's the only argument I ever won, I think, with Frank Sartor. But we were working on that, trying to change it from that, which is how it looked then, to... how it looks now, which is this. And of course, in doing that, we had to constrain a few people. And suddenly, this headline appeared on the front page, or I think it was the Telly. Jerry Peacock, who was then Minister for Local Government and member for Dubbo, in the Fay administration, was on the front page of the Telegraph with the headline, I'm fed up. And then it said something like $5,000 in the bank. And that was the excuse for sacking us. All they had to do was call an inquiry. They didn't have to find any corruption or incompetence. They only had to call an inquiry, and then they could sack the council. So this was clearly on. And I've later discovered, I have it on good authority, that one of the developers we'd upset had gone to the Premier and said, you've got to do something about this lot. They're too independent. They can't be controlled. And so it's really dangerous doing the right thing. So I remember we had this Frank, who you saw, and Julie Walton and I, three of us who were on our ticket, went rushing down to Parliament. They were passing this bill to sack us, and about 11:30 at night, so it was going to be sort of whizzed through in the middle of the night. We tore down from the town hall to Parliament in Macquarie Street, pleaded with the independents, who then, if you remember, held the balance of power for about 5 glorious minutes. So there was Clover, and there was John Hatton, and there was Peter MacDonald, and I can't remember if there's, I had the feeling there was 4. Anyway, and they saved us, basically, with, I have to say, Bob Carr and Jeff Shaw, those at the Labour Party. But so that was a long time ago. That was 20-something years ago. But nothing's really changed, except that we now have fewer independents with less power. And so the current wave of mass sackings of councils has had almost no opposition. And isn't it amazing how the councils that are sacked coincide with the areas of massive development? Anyone notice that? It happens that, for example, in Leichhardt, where there's massive objection to WestConnex, no council. Oops. That can just happen, just lose it. Parramatta, there was massive redevelopment happening. The stadium, the pool, the heritage site. Oops, no council. Northern Beaches, where there's massive resistance to, the turning of that nice piece of roadway with all the trees went into a sort of 12-lane motorway. Suddenly there's no council. Suddenly we have an appointed administrator. independent, of course. So council meetings become very quick. On the 15th of February, for example, this year, the Northern Beaches Council, as it's still known, held an extraordinary meeting. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. And actually, the minutes... Wait a minute. Oh, sorry. I should have showed you that picture of Jerry Peacock. This is a picture of the minutes of the minutes of those 17 minutes. The administrator, I've just had his name struck out of the column I'm writing for next week because apparently it's dangerous, libelous. But anyway, so I can't tell you who it is, but you'll have to Google it. There was only one member of council in attendance, and he put a minute to council, which was his own minute, and presumably seconded it because, you know. But the minutes read apologies, nil, confirmation of minutes, nil, declaration of interest, nil, public forum, nil, obviously, administrators' minutes, resolved, unanimous. So the meeting lasted from 2:32 p.m. to 2:49 p.m. Everything was agreed without any difficulty. I don't know if I'm alone in thinking this is just farcical. You know, if that was happening in Russia or China, you go, hang on, wait, that's not democracy. I'm surprised we're not marching in the streets about this stuff. While this is, happening or not happening, the world is changing out there. People's houses are being bulldozed, motorways are being built instead of them, and it's like, democracy? Of course, if we did march in the streets about this, we could be fined $5,000 each. I've got to go and do a little speech for Wendy Bacon and some people who are arrested protesting against WestConnex because they have been fined. I think 10 or 12 of them have been charged. So they need to raise funds because they need to plead not guilty, so they have to, blah, blah, go to court. Or, as happened to me when we were protesting about the destruction of the trees for the light rail, the fig trees on Anzac Parade, you can be standing there on a footpath, they can come and put a fence around you and then say, you're now on enclosed land, you can be arrested. Okay. Hang on, wait, this is public footpath. It happens, and it happened to me. I think that is so close to proto-fascism. My friends from Europe shake their heads and they say, it's happening again. It's happening again and you guys don't see it. So as I said, dark times. When doctors can be sacked or jailed for unauthorised disclosure about what's happening in our concentration camps. When educators talk about, as I got one the other day, what he called the code of silence within the school system that many consider militaristic. That was his word. When planning has all but vanished, with the smart planners sacked from governments and working exclusively for developers. When you can be fined thousands of dollars for peaceful protest on public land, and when the Prime Minister can seriously talk of copying America's Department of Homeland Security and not be just laughed off the stage. Much of that stupidity is the result not of democracy per se, but of party politics. George Washington warned repeatedly of the seeds of destruction within partisan democracy. He said, I was no party man myself, warning that the party system and factions, led by what he called cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men, distorted democracies. And again, I quote, that the disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. You think that's what we're seeing? Ted Mack's 2013 Henry Parkes oration is a similarly brilliant denouncement of partisan politics, which he describes, favourite phrase, as venal, vicious and vulgar. Again, I quote, as for public participation, he says, virtually all government decisions are made in private by small groups of people who are in many cases not in Parliament, and that parliamentarians immerse their energies, quote, in mutual denigration with little or no sensible parliamentary debate. You have to ask yourself, what is the point? Why are we paying these guys? So I think it's worth thinking about the kind of system that we might like instead. Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, who some of you might know, runs a thing called the New Democracy Foundation, which proposes one model. Their model is, he reminds us that Athenian democracy, as we like to think of it, had no elections and no parties. So there was no currying of favour, no pork barrelling, no branch stacking, none of that stuff. The New Democracy Foundation has undertaken a number of particular projects. This was an attempt to use random sortation of citizen juries, in other words, randomly selected juries from the populace at large, to be educated over a couple of weeks, talk to all the experts they need, and then make decisions, in this case about whether or not South Australia should take on board the role of nuclear waste processing. And 2/3 of them decided no. So it seems to me that there may be better, fairer, more honest ways of taking the warfare out of politics. This is one of them. Referenda and other means of direct democracy are slightly different variations on the same theme, and I know that Ted Mack has been a long-time supporter of referenda as a way of getting communities to make decisions directly. But that brings me to the last piece of my talk, which is about Sydney and what I think is the threat to the kind of Sydney that I love. I recently wrote a column which was called something like "Why I Would Not Buy a New Sydney Apartment." I was quite quickly invited to contribute a chapter to a book on the destructive, which I'm not going to do, it's too much like hard work, on the destructive, but it's an interesting book, on the destructive effects of neoliberalism on the Australian economy. And I'm thinking, economy, yeah, what do I care? And then I thought, of course, economy is just another word for ecology, or even actually life. Its primary drivers are not, as we like to think, the housing industry or interest rates or the All Ordinaries Index. The economy is actually a map of our emotions and our psychology. Its primary driver is desire. And in fact, when you think of it like that, maybe All Ordinaries is what it's about, after all. Every one of us, in other words, and our lives and our place on this planet. And when you do think of it like that, economy becomes very interesting. So I started making a little list of all the ways in which life on planet Sydney has been impacted by neoliberalism. And this is just a few dot points off the top of my head. The Greater Sydney Commission, supposedly independent, but unelected. And, oh heavens, run by rich people. The push to re-shrink city boundaries, the push to get rid of cycleways, especially ones that are already built, the push to get rid of car share, which was a Duncan Gay special, the removal of legislative protections from heritage and environment, which is happening constantly, the refusal to listen to or respond to community protest or even allow it, the lying and deceit from government that we've come to think is normal, the draconian anti-protest laws, the mass and possibly illegal sacking of councils, and of course the building everywhere of what I can only call slums. I've been looking for an apartment and I can't tell you how many bedrooms I've seen without windows. I mean, that's not legal. That is not legal, and yet they are being sold everywhere. Bathrooms with no windows, bedrooms with no windows. I really would not go there, but they are everywhere. The so-called investor-grade product really doesn't give a toss. And that's just off the top of my head. So, countering that, this is Sydney. This is the Sydney I've loved most of my adult life. I love the harbour, of course, as we all do, but more than the harbour, I love this crazy, crooked little heart of this nutty thing that no one should ever have built in this part of the world. It's impossibly narrow streets, it's ridiculously narrow houses, it's heart-stopping shadows and textures, none of which could ever be built today, which is weird, because look at what we are building. It's the way it's so perversely not suited to our climate or our culture or our lifestyle or our nature, but nevertheless there's this wonderful kind of proximity of everything. The beginning one was actually, that's a kind of not a major street, but it's a 3-lane street, and that's a bed, like right there. And I walk past it and I think, oh, I love Sydney. I love how it does that. It's so cool. It's like London, but crazier. Because it was poorer and everyone came here with no anything, no knowledge, no money, no anything, and rebuilt exactly the culture that had rejected them. I mean, how crazy is that? I think it's beautiful. And I love how this wonderful succulent nature twines itself into this fragile fabric. And then how all of that stuff, which was actually built as kind of slums, has now become the desired habitat for the barrister classes. That's quite cool. I think that's lovely. I mean, I know that's gentrification and it's bad, but it's kind of beautiful in a way as well. So this is Miller's Point, which, as you know, is about to be, most of this has been turned over now to the wealthy. These houses, which were public housing, are now worth around about $5 million each. Same. Fabulous. I mean, you'd have to love the way Sydney, this venal, crazy, crass city, puts the poorest of the poor in the best possible spot. I mean, how did that even happen? It's fantastic. It's fantastic. Of course, this is Sirius, which I have to show you because I went there for the first time the other day, got inside for the first time at least. This is kind of crazy and you may or may not like the building. I've always quite liked that stacked television sets kind of look, but yeah. It's probably an acquired taste, but this is a photo that I took from the bedroom window of the last remaining resident of the Sirius on the 10th floor, Myra Demetriou. She's 92 and blind, and that's her window. Help! She's now being threatened with the bailiffs. Everybody else is gone. There were 3, and then there were 2, and now there's just her. And it will be demolished and redeveloped and sold for private profit, even though it's public land. So, everywhere you look, it's like this wrecking ball hangs over Sydney. I've called it a perfect planning storm, but formed by the coincidence of everything happening at once. This is the interchange at St. Peter's, just slicing the bottom off the park for WestConnex, of course. I can't think why people don't want that in their neighbourhood. Why wouldn't you? I don't know what's wrong with them. This is people protesting about it. There's the light rail, of course, which goes up, Devonshire Street, and then over the top of Devonshire Street, it's something like all of the trees are going to be demolished. Half of them have been. 84 terrace houses are impacted by this thing. A terrace houses on that, I mean, the street's only about 10 metres wide. The houses are about 3 metres wide. They're going to have this right next to them. I'm a light rail fan, let me just say, but the way it's being done, I think, is so wrong. The carriages are 67 metres long, so that means just about a whole block length. I mean, that's huge, and that's because it was all given to a private contractor so early in the piece that none of the sensible decisions about speed and frequency and size of carriages could be made in the public interest. That was all signed away years ago, actually, which I think is a tragedy. There's the Strata Title Act, new one, which designed specifically to allow buildings to be demolished with 75% majority, so people can actually be turfed out, even though everyone says that's not true. And then the treatment of all public housing on Crown land, which it all is, as development site. It's all up for tender at the moment. Of course, you're supposed to put some public housing back, but the rules, who knows actually what's going to happen. And then there's Central to Everleigh. Oh yeah, light rail. That's Central to Everleigh. So essentially a new CBD, if that's what you want to call it, except most of that is probably going to be residential. Who knows? It's just towers. And again, it's not planned. It's not like the government says, this is how the streets will be, this is where the public amenity will be, this is how we're going to complete poor little Prince Alfred Park. That doesn't happen. They just go to developers. So what do you think? And developers say, well, it's got to be 50 stories, obviously, otherwise who can make a buck? And so that becomes the thing. And once you've said, oh, okay, that, you can't downzone, you can't climb back from that because that becomes the way land is valued, and then it's all over. So it's very difficult. Then, of course, there's the casino, which makes, you will have seen Barangaroo, which now looks quite sweet, doesn't it, by comparison? Small even, small. I used to think Barangaroo was a shocker. Now it looks little compared with the casino, which of course is also on public foreshore land. Go figure. And I went along to the public hearing, probably some of you did, days and days of it, and they all go, yes, 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 no, you're right, no, absolutely, public interest, yes, absolutely. And then the report said, yeah, no, we agree, public interest, but sorry, actually the decision was effectively made way back when Barry O'Farrell said, yes, you can have a second licence. So we might as well not have bothered. The planning, whatever it's called, commission, might as well not exist. That was a complete waste of time. The only thing it did was to make people feel that they were being listened to, and in fact, they weren't. So, madness, badness, and sadness. But I think you can't be too cynical about this stuff. It really is very dangerous. I really think that the Sydney I love is under threat, and I will be very cross. Let me just say, very cross, if they have their way with it. I wrote that piece, actually. This piece. Sydney will be unrecognisable now that the planners have gone, was the headline. And Rob Stokes, who was then the planning minister, wrote a reply saying, no, she's just anti-development. And then the planners also wrote a reply saying it's not true, we're still in the room, takes exception to the suggestion that planners have left the room. And my friend Carl Fisher, a professor of planning history who was here tonight, gave me the best line, the planners haven't left the room, they're in the room with the developers. You might actually say in bed, but he was being polite, I guess. I think that is actually the problem. I think we really have to look after our city. This was put out by the North Parramatta Resident Action Group yesterday, I think, begging Clover to adopt them. I mean, that's sweet, but it's really sad. They shouldn't have to. They should have their own democracy. They should have council meetings that last more than 5 minutes, that have more than one member, or more than one voice. There should be actual debate about what's happening. I mean, they've been wildly active on social media and nothing changes. It's wrong. It's just wrong. So we come back to truth, beauty and justice. Tell the truth, act on principle, strive for beauty, believe in equality, decency, open government and local government. I see the truth, beauty, justice thing as a sort of Venn diagram, and the point where they overlap, where they intersect, the intersection set, is in my head, in my crazy head, I call that God. But you could just call it the angel self that lives in all of us. And I suppose that's where I want to come back to that. I think we all need to be involved with this stuff, and we all need to channel our angel selves, as I think Ted Mack has done for decades, to show us how to really engage our best selves and make this the best city it can possibly be. As long as that spirit lives on, which I think is the spirit of independent politics here, then the city has a hope, and we need to nurture that spirit and appreciate everything that Ted Mack ever did for this town. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was very special. I'd like to invite you all now to join us in the foyer to chat amongst yourselves and enjoy the refreshments. There is a comments book in the foyer if you'd like to leave some comments about the star of this evening, Ted. It's over near the large poster you might have noticed on your way in. If you have any friends that haven't been able to come tonight and would like to leave a comment on Council's homepage, you'll find an electronic version of the comments there as well. So I invite you all to rise now, and Ted will join you in the foyer after you've departed. So thank you for coming.